West Germany, January 1963. The tarmac at CFB Baden-Surlingen is black ice and frozen fog. The pine forests beyond the perimeter fence have disappeared into grey. A Canadian pilot walks across the flight line. His boots crack against the frost. He is 26 years old. He has a wife on this base. He did not wake her. He stops beneath his aircraft. It is a CF-104 Starfighter, needle-nosed, razor-winged. So geometrically violent, it looks less like a machine and more like a decision. Hanging beneath the fuselage, in the pre-dawn dark, is an American tactical nuclear weapon. He climbs in. The Arenda engine winds up. Not a roar, a rising fury. The klaxon has already sounded. 11 minutes to wheels up. Here is what almost no one back home understood. Canada, the United Nations peacekeeper, the quiet diplomat, the good, honest ally, had placed its young men on the absolute forward edge of World War III. Nuclear strike pilots assigned to NATO's low-level attack mission. No escort, no second chance. And the jet beneath them was already killing them. Not in combat, in peacetime. The question was never about the mission. It was about how Canada ended up here at all. To understand how Canada got here, you have to go back to February 20th, 1959. One government order, one phone call, and the most advanced jet interceptor ever designed in the Western world was dead before it ever flew in service. The Avro Arrow, designed and built in Moulton, Ontario, was cancelled, the tooling destroyed, the prototypes cut apart. 25,000 of the most skilled aerospace workers in Canadian history walked out into the cold with termination papers. If you want the full story of the Arrow's tragic end, the link is in the description. The matters here is what that cancellation left behind, a void. The RCAF had built its entire future around the Arrow. Overnight that future was gone. No replacement, no backup plan, no domestic alternative. Ottawa needed a jet, not in 5 years, not after careful study, now. The Cold War didn't pause for Canadian politics. Soviet bombers were real. NATO commitments were binding. Allies were watching. The Americans had something ready. Lockheed's F-104 Starfighter was already flying with the US Air Force, already proven, already available. Canada moved quickly, faster perhaps than a thorough evaluation of the mission requirements would have recommended. The Canadian variant, the CF-104, was assembled by Canadair in Montreal and powered by the J-79 engine built under license by Arenda. Canadian hands, Canadian factory, American soul. The machine itself was extraordinary. A fuselage barely wide enough for a man's shoulders, wings barely 10 feet from the fuselage on either side. So thin, so sharp, ground crews needed leather gloves to handle them. Kelly Johnson at Lockheed had built it for one purpose: climb fast, go high, intercept Soviet bombers at 50,000 feet, come home. At altitude, doing Mach 2, it was a marvel of engineering. Then NATO changed the mission. By the early 1960s, NATO increasingly emphasized low-level nuclear strike missions to penetrate Soviet radar defenses. The strategy? Fly beneath detection at 100 feet, deliver a tactical nuclear weapon deep behind enemy lines, and hope the defenses never saw you coming. The CF-104's air-to-air missiles were stripped out, its gun removed in the early strike configuration. Many of the systems optimized for high-altitude interception were removed or repurposed. In their place, one American tactical nuclear weapon hung beneath the fuselage, and a mission profile that asked the Mach 2 interceptor designed for the stratosphere to skim German treetops through winter fog at 600 knots, with zero margin for error. Kelly Johnson built a thoroughbred racehorse. NATO asked it to run a different kind of race entirely, low, fast, and through the fog. The Canadians, operating within NATO commitments and limited options, climbed in anyway, because the alliance required it, because Ottawa had committed, because that is what you do when you are a small country trying to prove you belong at the table. What nobody told the pilots was how many of them wouldn't be coming back from the training runs. The CF-104 was not a forgiving aircraft under any conditions. At low level, it was something close to homicidal. Start with the wings. 7.5 feet per side, razor thin, optimized entirely for supersonic performance at altitude. At 50,000 feet, they were genius. At 100 feet, doing 600 knots over rolling German farmland, they generated almost no lift margin. The aircraft had to keep moving. Always fast, always precise. because any hesitation in speed or control input didn't produce a warning. It produced a crash. Then there was the T-tail. The Starfighter's horizontal stabilizer sat at the top of the tail fin. At high angles of attack, when a pilot pulled back hard on the stick, the disturbed airflow from the wings could blanket the tail completely, stripping it of effectiveness at the exact moment the pilot needed control most. The jet would pitch up, then fall. At altitude, a skilled pilot might recover. At 100 feet over the Rhine Valley, there was no sky left to recover in. But the most quietly lethal feature was the ejection seat. Early Canadian CF-104s were fitted with a downward-firing ejection seat, a design choice that made theoretical sense for high-altitude escape, but was functionally dangerous at low altitude. As the toll mounted, aircraft were progressively upgraded to upward-firing seats. But for years, Canadian pilots flew knowing their emergency escape system was nearly useless at the altitude they flew every mission. The J-79 engine completed the picture. Powerful and sophisticated, it demanded precise handling. Abrupt throttle inputs at low altitude could trigger a compressor stall. The engine simply stops. At altitude, a stall is a serious emergency. At 100 feet, the interval between stall and impact could be measured in under 3 seconds. The CF-104 was not a bad aircraft. It was an aircraft originally designed for interception, now pushed into extremely demanding low-level strike missions, and it communicated that mismatch clearly, and often, and in the worst possible way. CFB Baden-Surlingen was, by most accounts, a decent place to live. There were schools, a hockey rink, a mess hall. Canadian families had packed up their lives, from small Ontario towns, from the prairies, from Montreal suburbs, and rebuilt them here in southwest Germany, a few kilometers from the French border. On quiet mornings you could hear church bells from the village beyond the fence. On other mornings you heard the crash siren. The wives learned what it meant. The children, eventually, did too. It meant a jet was down. It meant someone's husband, someone's father, wasn't coming home for dinner. It meant a staff car was driving slowly through base housing, and wherever it stopped, that family's life divided permanently into before and after. There was no preparing for it. There was only waiting. The pilots carried this differently. These were not reckless men. They were professionals, selected, trained, clear-eyed, who had looked honestly at the mathematics of their situation and chosen to fly anyway. Not from bravado, from duty. NATO needed them in those cockpits. Canada's place in the alliance required it. Someone far above their rank had decided this was the price of membership, and they had accepted that without being asked. At 100 feet and 600 knots, there was no room for fear. There was only the next second. Terrain, systems, weather, navigation, all of it simultaneously, all of it faster than conscious thought. The fear came later, at night, in the quiet. Former pilots describe lying awake, running through scenarios methodically, not obsessing, problem-solving. It was psychological maintenance, exhausting in ways no flight physical could measure. Ottawa, meanwhile, quietly classified the full extent of the losses. The Canadian public had almost no idea what was happening to their airmen in Europe. Families grieved inside the bureaucratic language of training accidents and operational incidents, and still, every morning, the klaxon was there if it was needed. As the losses mounted, one question formed in every mess hall, every kitchen, every briefing room that would never say it aloud. How many men was this alliance worth? The numbers don't arrive all at once. They accumulate. A CF-104 goes down outside Zweibrücken. Engine failure on a low-level run. The pilot doesn't survive. A report is filed. A family is notified. The squadron flies the next morning. Another goes down in spring. Bird strike. The intake ingests something large at 600 knots and the engine stops, and there is no sky left beneath the aircraft to do anything about it. Another report. Another family. Another morning on the flight line. And then another. And another. By the time the CF-104's European career was over, Canada had lost 110 aircraft, not to enemy action, not to war, to training, to weather, to the extreme demands of low-level NATO strike operations that pushed both men and machine beyond comfortable margins. 37 Canadian pilots dead in peacetime. For context, Canada lost 57 military personnel across the entire decade-long Afghanistan conflict. one of the country's most costly modern commitments. The CF-104 program killed 37 aircrew in a fraction of that time, with a fraction of the public attention, and almost none of the national reckoning. The jet had earned its nickname honestly, the lawn dart, a reference to its tendency, when things went wrong, to go straight into the earth at an angle that left very little to recover. Ground crews used the term with the particular gallows humour that develops in any profession where the mortality rate exceeds what people are willing to say out loud. Canada was not alone. The German Air Force flew the same aircraft and suffered a far larger catastrophe. Nearly 300 Luftwaffe F-104s were lost, with 116 pilots killed. In West Germany, it became a full national scandal. Parliamentary inquiries, front-page headlines, public outrage. In Canada, it was managed quietly. The Cold War demanded stoicism. Allies were watching. Commitments had been made. The specific killers recurred with grim regularity. Bird strikes in the agricultural Rhine Valley, where wildlife met 600-knot airframes with predictable results. Winter fog that swallowed terrain with no warning. Compressor stalls that gave pilots under 3 seconds between engine silence and ground impact, and the cases investigators logged as controlled flight into terrain. The aircraft functioning, the pilot conscious, and something in the sequence of demands simply consuming 1 second too many. Ottawa absorbed each loss with the cold language of defence policy, an acceptable loss rate. Whether the 37 men who comprised that rate would have used the word acceptable is a question the official record never asked. What the official record did not predict was what happened next. The RCAF did not break. What emerged instead was something rarer, the specific competence that develops when an institution decides, without fanfare, that it will master the thing that is trying to kill it. It didn't happen in a single moment. It happened the way real change always does, through accumulated hard knowledge, forensic study of every failure, and a culture that treated each crash not only as a tragedy, but as a lesson the next pilot needed to survive. Accident reports were dissected, near misses debriefed in exhaustive detail, tactics rewritten, training restructured from the ground up. Canadian pilots began to know the CF-104 the way a surgeon knows a difficult instrument, not comfortably, with total, unsparing intimacy. They mapped exactly where it would try to kill them, and developed the anticipatory precision to deny it the opportunity. The same razor wings that punished hesitation rewarded absolute mastery with extraordinary speed. The same engine that flamed out on careless inputs delivered raw acceleration for pilots who had learned its rhythms. Through blood and discipline, the RCAF had produced something the Alliance hadn't expected, the finest low-level strike pilots in NATO. The proof came publicly at the NATO Tactical Weapons Meet, the Alliance's premier air power competition. Low-level navigation, weapons delivery accuracy, time-on-target precision. Every major NATO air force competed, American, British, German, Dutch. The Canadians won, not narrowly. The RCAF CF-104 crews outflew every air force in the Western Alliance on the same stage, with the same aircraft, with vastly fewer resources behind them. Allied observers described a quiet recalibration in the watching crowds. The Canadians had arrived with a reputation built on losses and stoic professionalism. They left with the unqualified respect of every pilot in the Alliance. 37 men were still dead. 110 aircraft were still gone. No competition result changes that calculus, but the achievement was real. Canada had been handed an American jet, assigned an American mission, operating within the constraints of an alliance that left limited room for alternatives, and produced, through sacrifice that should never have been necessary, the best low-level strike aviators on Earth. The Widowmaker had met its match. But mastery of someone else's machine, on someone else's terms, is that sovereignty, or just a more impressive form of dependency? Canada was about to spend the next 40 years finding out. Nothing in military service ends cleanly. The CF-104 faded, squadron by squadron, base by base, through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, replaced gradually by the McDonnell Douglas CF-18 Hornet, another American aircraft, procured again from south of the border, built again to American specifications. adapted again to Canadian requirements that were never quite the original design consideration. The pattern, for anyone paying attention, was difficult to ignore. The last Canadian CF-104s left Europe in 1986. The bases followed, Baden-Söllingen, Lahr, closing in the early 1990s as the Cold War wound down and Ottawa quietly reassessed commitments it could no longer afford. 3 decades of Canadian infrastructure, communities built around runways, families who had made lives in a foreign country in service of an alliance, dismantled with the efficient silence of a shrinking defense budget. What remained was legacy, and legacy here was complicated. 110 aircraft destroyed, 37 men dead, hundreds of millions spent on an airframe operating in conditions beyond its original design envelope. By those numbers alone, the CF-104 program was a study in the consequences of procurement made under pressure, without sufficient time to fully define what Canada actually needed. But legacy is never only one thing. Those same years forged a generation of aviators whose reputation spread across the entire Western Alliance. The RCAF emerged from the Starfighter era with a credibility that statistics alone cannot capture. The veterans carried it with characteristic honesty, proud of what they had achieved, clear-eyed about what it had cost. No triumphalism, no denial, just the quiet acknowledgement that something very difficult had been done, at a price that should never have been required, by men who deserved better odds. The aircraft were gone. The nuclear weapons quietly returned to American custody. The bases fell silent. But the questions the CF-104 raised about sovereignty, dependency, about what Canada surrenders when it outsources its defense industrial capacity to allies with their own priorities, those questions didn't retire with the jet. They were waiting. The modern dilemma. In 2026, Canada still has not fielded a CF-18 replacement. Let that settle. The CF-18 has been in service for over 4 decades. Designed in the 1970s, the airframes flying today are older than most of the pilots inside them, upgraded, extended, patched through service life extensions never envisioned in the original design. Canada has been flying jets that were already aging when the Berlin Wall fell. The procurement process meant to fix this has become one of the most politically tortured defense acquisition stories in Canadian history. At the center, the F-35. Lockheed Martin's 5th-generation stealth fighter is, by most assessments, an extraordinary machine. It is also extraordinarily expensive, with sustainment costs and supply chain dependencies locked to American political goodwill in ways Ottawa does not fully control. Canada has been here before, precisely here. An American jet, alliance pressure, a domestic alternative already long dead. The CF-104 wasn't poorly designed. It was a capable aircraft placed into an extremely demanding mission profile. Canada paid for that gap in 37 lives. The Saab Gripen offers a different argument. Cheaper, designed for austere, dispersed operations, matching Canada's vast and logistically demanding geography. A country, Sweden, that will not quietly suggest a procurement decision might strain bilateral relations. The F-35 camp responds that operating outside the 5th-generation envelope is simply the cost of irrelevance. Both arguments have merit. Neither is entirely wrong, but underneath the capability debates and unit costs, the CF-104's ghost keeps asking the same question it has always asked. When Canada finally signs that contract, will the choice be made on Canada's terms, or will it be made, as it was in 1959, because an ally needed an answer, and Canada needed to be seen as reliable, and the ability to say, "We'll build our own," had long since been cut apart and walked out the door. The ghost of the CF-104 isn't history, it's policy, and Canada still hasn't decided what it learned. Somewhere in the archives there is a photograph, a CF-104 on the ramp at Baden-Söllingen, frost on the tarmac, a pilot walking toward it, flight suit, helmet bag, the purposeful stride of a man who has made his peace with what the next hour requires. He has a name, a family, a favorite hockey team, a specific way he takes his coffee. He is also, in that moment, a thread in something far larger than himself, an alliance, a procurement decision made in Ottawa before he was trained, a doctrine written by men who would never sit in that cockpit. The Avro Arrow was the dream. What Canada could have built, what Canada could have been. The CF-104 was the reality. what Canada actually flew, what its pilots actually survived, and in 37 cases did not. Those 37 men were not footnotes. They were not acceptable losses. They were Canadian men who flew an impossible mission in an imperfect machine, far from home, without sufficient acknowledgement, without sufficient gratitude. They deserved better equipment. They deserved better odds. They deserved to come home. The frost still comes to Baden-Zellingen in January. Some debts do not expire.